Hello everybody, my name is Jimmy Smith and welcome to the Wine with Jimmy channel. I'm so glad that you've stopped by. We are looking at this section on what's called explaining wine terminology. So there are some concepts within wine which need a bit more of a definition, and that's what we do here. So this is quite ideal for those of you studying certainly your diploma, that's your level 4 WSET, but also those of you maybe studying your level 3 as well. This is probably a little bit above your pay grade, but it really can actually be quite interesting for you and great to discuss these topics as well. As always, this video is free content on YouTube, is also found on the e-learning portal. That's at winewithjimmy.com. And if you want to leave any comments, questions or concerns, you can do so. You could do so at the bottom of this video on the YouTube platform on the comments section. Please make sure you click subscribe, or you can get in touch with the social media that you see at the bottom of every slide, or direct through the website www.winewithjimmy.com. Okay, so on this video, we are looking at the very murky waters of terroir. So terroir is a very interesting word. It is a French concept originally, and then really sort of solidified within the old world, but is now talked across the whole world of wine, including the new world. But many people have an understanding or maybe a certain view of terroir, but unfortunately, most people just see it as the earth, but in fact, that is not correct. There's a multitude of things that we must discuss when we talk about terroir. So we're going to go into pretty much describing it, defining it as best as we can, but of course there are some grey areas with this, but we'll define it the best way we can, and we can see what may impact terroir as well. Okay, so yes, I mean, this is a holding first slide, but this gives you an idea of, in fact, what people really generally think of terroir. So, for example, if you're at a big trade tasting, or if you're even at a winemaker tasting, whatever, often the question will be asked, what's the terroir of this wine? And the answer normally given will be, oh, it's grown on this kind of a soil. It's on this kind of geology. And that's the kind of very basic definition of terroir, but it's much more encompassing. There's overarching themes that we need to discuss within it as well. So that's what the next slide here is all about. So first of all, the word itself, terroir, comes from the French word terre, meaning land. So of course it is going to be something to do with the land, but really the inputs within that land, which are quite multifaceted. It is, as I mentioned, it's much used in wine to help describe certain things about the wine. It's also used in the marketing of wine. Really, a lot of marketing is around the terroir. And as I mentioned, it's an overarching concept which claims that the distinctiveness of quality wines is due to their sense of place, their sense of location. But this definition that we're going to go through here is not agreed by many. There are many different discussions to be had within it. So there's no real set, precise, agreed definition. But we'll go through it. We'll go through the number of different key points to look at. And you'll see here, very general kind of picture with some diagrams here, but the terrain is a part of terroir. The geology on the top right is a part of terroir. The climate and weather conditions are a part of terroir, and also human influence on the bottom left, which is one that often gets forgotten. And that is how humans control grape growing and wine production, how that can be described as terroir as well. So first of all, the one that many people really link to as certainly their first definition of terroir is really the sense of place. So a wine will show characteristics that relate to the particular place in which the grapes come from. And that's things, of course, that are listed here. Climate, the geology, so the soils, etc. aspect, so the topography of the landscape, and elevation, for instance, and the altitude. Also at the bottom there, yeast, the question mark as well. And that's an important one. But before I get on to yeast, I just want to mention those 4 concepts above it. And this relates to a place. So this is a physical definition, okay? And it's, you know, examples we can give is an example that you find on the map just to the left-hand side of this slide. So wines made from grapes with only like 100, 200 meters apart within the Côte d'Or in Burgundy. And here in this picture is the Corton Hill, which has all that red area is the Grand Cru parts of the Corton Hill. The orange is Premier Cru, and then the yellow is village or commune level. And really, Chardonnay grown from one plot to another, and even within the same plot, the same with Pinot Noir as well, will have differences due to things like, really here, things like aspect and geology more than anything. More overarching concepts here, which are quite similar, is really the climate. But really, geology can differ within a small area, certainly with fault lines. Aspect can differ, and you'll see here, now Le Charlemagne, which you'll see just here, this is facing south, and then you've got lots of these bits facing east. So you've got lots of different aspects here, which can quite significantly impact the final style of the wine. Elevation as well, going higher up the hill, for instance, here as well. So these differences, which can be small, can actually make significant differences on the wine style. So you really get a feel for the place and that location. The yeast one is an interesting one. I put it in here on this slide, and I will have a next slide on it as well. It's because we have what's called native yeasts or wild yeast or ambient yeast, which can be found within the vineyard. So therefore it is technically could be a physical definition, but then of course it then comes into the winemaking side of it, of course, as it ferments with our wine. So that's what we're looking at here on this one. So as I mentioned, we include yeast here as wild yeasts, and wild yeast can be called also ambient yeasts, native yeasts, providing spontaneous and wild fermentations and so on. They are present in the vineyard. So an uninoculated ferment, so that means not adding yeast, and these are the natural yeasts that we've just talked about. The early stages of fermentations are carried out in these uninoculated yeast fermentations by these native yeasts. And there are many types. I've given you one example in a picture here of Torrospora del Brucai, but there are others as well. Cluveromyces, there's also Istamarella, Pichia, Rhodotorura as well, quite a few different wild species. If you examine grapes or look in the vineyard, it's very hard to find what we call the brewer's yeast, which is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. But all of the other ones, which are actually grouped together called the non-sacs, because Saccharomyces is the major yeast, they are very abundant in places like wineries and in the vineyard, for example. And they tend to carry out the first stages of fermentation. And then Saccharomyces tends to come in, gets its act together, and it finishes things off. But the majority of the ferments always tend to be completed by Saccharomyces. It's actually quite tolerant to higher alcohol levels. It works with sulfur. It has quite a good resistance against sulfur, which is used quite commonly in the production of wine. It's also found within wine as well. So really, it's quite an interesting concept, because some people believe that these wild yeasts are a part of terroir. Some people don't, and that's why they use Saccharomyces. And also Saccharomyces, the major yeast that makes a lot of beer and wine today, which has of course been massively produced, and that's what we tend to say is the inoculated yeast. This often by a lot of commentators is what they say is a human influence. So it's not a terroir, but there are other commentators that say Saccharomyces is originally, a long time ago from the wild, and it's just actually been cultivated by human activity over years. So there is an argument that it still is, but of course you'll hear many wine producers talk about how they like to only utilize wild yeasts. They don't add in any others. They will have Saccharomyces present in their wineries, but they don't add in anything. And they say that this gives a certain taste to their wine, which could be a sense of place. So that's why we talk about it in terms of terroir. I suppose the question is, though, will it be wild strains of the yeast Saccharomyces, or will it be a single strain that's resident in the winery and that kind of overpowers the fermentation? There's lots of things to talk about here. So it's a very grey area, and it's something that the microbial activity in the winery is something we're gaining a lot more knowledge of in the recent years. But it's a new concept for us to really get to grips with. So there definitely is a discussion to be had around how yeast certainly impacts terroir, for instance. And then looking at the geology of the vineyards as well. So this is normally exceptionally used for marketing purposes. You'll see this in descriptions of wines, and of course in the bios of certain wine styles and wineries and so on. Wines will claim often, so the producers of these wines will claim that the geological makeup of the soil directly influences the style of the wine. So for example, saying that a flint makes a smoky characteristic in Puy-Fumé, for example. The chalkiness in Chardonnay, for example, is due to the Kimeridian soils in Chablis. Now, what they are implying here is that the vine is taking up those elements, and then that's in the wine. You are gaining that taste from the wine. There isn't a direct correlation. Scientists and geologists will tell you that, of course, it is impossible to gain these characteristics from the soil because they are not soluble. They are also odorless and tasteless. So, even if you picked up some flint and then started to lick it, you're not going to get the same sort of characteristics that we think in our mind. So it's an interesting concept. Geologists are quite strict on this. They do say, of course, it just doesn't happen. But the characteristics that we use in wine speak is much more about metaphorical instances or mental associations. The characteristic is potentially produced by an indirect way. So for instance, in these areas that you tend to get this mineral note, you may say something like stoniness, flintiness, chalkiness, whatever it may be. It's often due to the very high acidities that are produced from these types of soils. And you gain this kind of mineral characteristic through the acidity. And that's how we've always associated it. It's not actually that we're tasting chalk or we're tasting flint through the smoky character, but it's more a mental association more than anything. The example I've got on the slide here is Chablis. So you'll see on the left-hand side is Kimeridian marl. Marl is a type of clay and limestone, a mudstone, as it were. And this is the soil that's very classic in Grand Cru Chablis, but also some other Premier Crus as well. This is a sedimentary soil, so it is a deposited soil of limestone base formed 160 million years ago. And it can convey this very sort of high tensile, racy characteristic in the wine. Lots of people, of course, associate chalkiness or mineral or oyster shells or something along those lines, but it is really due to this kind of acidity more than anything. The other one, Portlandian, is actually found around Chablis as well, so more Petit Chablis, and also the Grand Auxerrois, which is around that area. This was formed a little bit earlier, 140 to 150 million years ago, and it tends to make wines with good acidities, but not as tensile intense as Kimeridian marl, for example. And we tend to therefore associate less minerality to the Portlandian due to that. So you will get, certainly with sense of place through mental associations and metaphorical associations with these geological structures, you will get some of these characteristics, I think, in a sense of place in the wine. But this certainly impacts the style of the wine. It's, of course, very much. And then the human influence here as well, the one that often gets forgotten about. Some commentators include human interventions in the concept of terroir. So, for example, French PDOs, that is on the left here, that's the European stamp there, the protected designation of origin. French PDOs, Appellation d'origine protégée, or AOC as well in a more traditional sense, stipulate things like the planting density, so how many vines per acre, per hectare, the type of trellising that you have to use. So in Beaujolais, for instance, for Cru Beaujolais, Beaujolais Village, you have to utilize the gobelet, the bush vine system, for example. And also things like, of course, yield limits to control quality. So these are human influences, but they protect the type, the typicity, the classic, and the quality of that area. They are there designed to protect quality, of course. So this is more of a cultural definition. So we talked about physical definitions earlier. But these, of course, do include physical elements, the vine themselves, the trellising, and, of course, the production of the grapes. So, therefore, it's a bit of a grey area, again, that transcends both the cultural and the physical element of terroir. So, of course, a lot of that is about trying to protect the terroir aspect, trying to protect where that wine comes from, the sense of place, even if it's through human influence. But of course, in many instances, the sense of place, in fact, is lost. And it is lost due to the fact maybe of the homogeneous nature of the winemaking, the commercial, the conventional, producing quite typical common styles, which are quite hard to differentiate from other styles in the world. And this is often through a number of things. This says overzealous winemaking. This could be grape growing as well, certainly with overripe fruit in that instance. So many commentators believe that these concepts listed here can of course obscure terroir. So they could kind of limit it and mask it. So picking overripe fruit, for example. So if you leave the grapes on the vine longer, often you get huge amounts of sugar levels, maybe very ripe phenolics, and you tend to probably lose the characteristics that you may find that are more delicate, that may come from the location. A great example of this is Pinot Noir when it's grown in the northern hemisphere on an aspect which is more westerly or southwesterly in comparison to more easterly or southeasterly. And that overripe fruit, you tend to lose any kind of characteristic which is more delicate, fresher, and maybe something as a sense of place, because the fruit becomes jammy and sweet, and it's hard to taste anything beyond it. Over extraction is winemaking, so this is over skin contact, maybe with high temperatures, and gaining more phenolic compounds from the skins, color, and you may lose any of that sense of place with kind of over extraction. The wines become very chunky, very rich. Inoculated yeast strains. Now, of course, this is Saccharomyces and all the different types of Saccharomyces being used to gain certain type of flavor profiles from the fermentations. So, for example, you could go onto a big server like Amazon, and there are others available, and buy a number of type of yeast strains if you are maybe making beer at home or wine at home or whatever, cider, for example. And it will give you a clear description of what this yeast will do in its fermentation. It will produce passion fruit compounds and elderflower compounds, grassy compounds, whatever it may be. They have been designed for that. And of course, in wine, if these are used, which are commonly used, they gain this very homogeneous character, which tends to then detract from what's from the vineyards, or can detract from it. And then, of course, how wine is matured. New oak, of course, or maybe oak chippings as well can impart a hell of a lot of flavor. They can add complexity, but of course can mask any concepts of a sense of place. And this is very obvious. You can taste a very oaked Chardonnay from anywhere in the world, and it's very difficult to pinpoint where it's from if it's exceptionally over oaked, because the wine will tend to just have that vanilla, coconut, creamy sort of character, which could be anywhere in the world. So you lose your sense of place in that instance. And lastly, the last slide is really about terroir and something we call precision viticulture, which is something I discuss at length on my my D1 of WSET Level 4. It's in the section about approaches to grape growing. So this in instances, you know, while terroir has been strongly associated with the French and other European areas, but specifically French, the word comes from that, remember, and then Europe. Winemakers around the world are now showing a huge interest in terroir and the differences that wine will gain from different sites. And this is being strengthened certainly in the new world, but also in more forward-thinking, innovative parts of the old world in terms of soil mapping and zonals and things like that you see here, which is precision viticulture. So you can actually start to get very clear scientific ideas about the different terroir in a certain location. Okay, so that's the rather long discussion of terroir done. I hope you found this useful. There's lots to talk about. I do apologize about the fact that sometimes I kept saying that it's a bit of a gray area, or it transcends, or it's overarching, and that's because terroir is a difficult concept. It's a very good idea for you to go and study a bit more, research a bit more, look at some key commentators to get a bigger idea about this, because of course it's a heavily debated point. Now, this is part of a series called Explaining Wine Terminology. This is good for those of you studying things like your WSET Level 4. But we do have that wonderful resource, which is called the Wine with Jimmy e-learning portal. That's at www.winewithjimmy.com. Here is just a snippet of what you can have if you sign up to the e-learning portal. So if you're studying levels 1, 2, 3, 4, to be honest, you're not going to need much for level 1, but levels 2, 3, and certainly level 4 diploma, we've got a huge wealth of information, video content like this, many exclusive videos, written questions, multiple choice, flashcards, revision sessions, all at the click of your mouse. And it's very, very useful, and it's very good supplemental to help you with your wine studies. Go and visit, go and have a look for your wine studies. Thank you so much then, everybody. I hope you found this useful. If you do find yourself in London, in the United Kingdom, sometime in the future, then please come and see me at one of my bars or schools. So come and see me for a class, a glass, or a bottle. Cheers for now. Bye-bye.